And welcome to this book release and discussion on fighting COVID-19. We are very lucky to have Mr. N.K. Singh with us today, Chairman, 15th Finance Commission. As you would have heard, him talking about his experience, a little bit of it. And we also have a distinguished panel, Mr. Tarun Das, our chairman. So in fact, often I kind of ignore the welcoming part because Mr. Das, I take you as an insider and don't know whether to welcome you to IEG or make you part of the welcoming team. And welcome Rohini. She is a member of our Board of Governors, again, one of our insider. And welcome Professor Sudipta Mandul. Again, you must have had some association with IEG at some point.
I used to be on a board once upon a time.
Okay, given your long careers. So we have a rich panel here, very rich in experience and scholarship, and I'm glad we'll get them to share their thoughts with us. I've never been part of any e-release. I'm sure that's true for most of you here. Over the last 3 months, there have been so many firsts in our lives. And this crisis is probably the first and hopefully the last in our lifetime. It's been unique in many ways. And in fact, the fact that, being somebody from Odisha, I cannot help, mention that for the first time in history, the Chariot Festival is being held in Puri, or was held in Puri this morning without any presence of devotees. So it's been a unique journey so far. Now, this special setting, in some sense, is responsible for all of us at the institute coming together, and we all sat down sometime in the second week of April, towards the end of the first lockdown, that is, and then we had several rounds of discussion and came up with this project. So I'm going to briefly talk about that or introduce that project to you in a minute. But so there are two aspects to it. First is, we are now launching, and again, we are grateful to N.K. Singh ji for that. And so in a normal setting, sir, you would have used the ribbon to cut something, but we'll pretend that it's being done. So we are launching this series called IEG Insights. Okay, so I'm going to briefly share you the philosophy behind it a little bit. And also this compilation where several of us have done research papers on different aspects of the present crisis. But I must say this, I must point out, so when you see the chapters, it's on the web now. We have to bear in mind that, this is a very difficult task they have taken. Making assessment and reflections on this exercise where when they started, there was very little data. And, given that we're talking about an infectious disease, it's very, very dynamic. And things are changing every day. So in fact, we have had so many rounds of updating that at some point I say, let's stop it, because there will be more in the series. So we expect to have a full, properly updated volume. So we have to bear that in mind when we are reading them. So what now I'm going to do is, if it's all right, I'm going to share the screen and do it in a 2-3 minutes presentation. If I can get it to working. Okay, is the sharing screen working?
No.
No?
At least I can't see it.
Okay, well.
I can't either.
Okay.
Yes,
now?
it's come.
Now we can
get.
Yeah.
Okay, so just quickly, I want to, because you cannot see my, hopefully all the authors are here. In fact, they are here. It's just that, we are not able to make them visible. But, at some point, if we have queries, we'll try to unmute them and they can answer anything that they have. So I'm going to just say a few things on there. Okay, so this is three aspects behind these IEG insights that we are calling. Firstly, IEG has this multidisciplinary tradition, and we have this multi-sectoral expertise. In some sense, health, agriculture, labor market, and so we have kind of thought that we'll use our expertise to offer valuable insights on particular problems. So that's number one. Secondly, the whole idea is to encourage collaboration both within and outside the institute. So as when you go through the compilation, you will see that a lot of people have written or worked jointly. So that's wonderful to see in a research institute. And the third aspect is that these are meant to be quick turnaround compilations. So these are research based, but time is of essence. So we want it to be out very quickly. And that's leaving scope for further research to individual authors. Okay, so here is a broad summary of what we have in the book or what to expect in the book. So the first two chapters by Professor Manoj Panda and Prabhakar Sao and Ashwin, they're looking at macro picture. Okay, and in fact, when they finished writing these two pieces, they came up with predictions about negative growth. So there was a lot of curiosity amongst us saying because in the newspapers in the first and second week of May, people were still talking about some slow, low but positive possible growth. But obviously now we all expect that we're going to contract heavily. But more than the numbers, I think it's the way they are handling the problem or approaching how to evaluate the impact. So that's interesting. Then we have both Indrani Gupta, Professor Indrani Gupta and William Joe and his colleagues have looked at the health sector. And he's looking at the health preparedness in some sense. That's very important because in past we have had pandemics, we have had chances, but somehow we probably, there have been scares, there have been near misses, but we probably didn't learn, we didn't use those lessons enough. So we haven't been able to build a resilient health system. And that's what's been exposed here. And so this is talking about how we can go about doing it. And there's also another interesting aspect which has come up and which is, I think, worth analyzing and discussing or researching in future. That's the public-private divide. See, in many cases, what happens when the public investment or public sector shrinks in any particular area, for example, health and education in Indian context, there is space created and the private sector moves in, which works fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong in it, which works fine in normal times, but anything resembling a crisis where we do need the public goods nature, that's when this creates a problem, as we have seen in the current crisis. So that's something worth looking into. Then William and others have looked at the mortality. We normally see the discussion about direct mortality, but behind the scene there has been the fact that resource allocation has gone in towards COVID-19. So this has obviously has impact on other things, and they're looking at how it's affecting maternal and child health. Then agriculture, obviously agriculture is and will continue to be in focus for quite some time, or in fact all the time. But during the crisis, it has obviously been very important, not just for the food security aspect, but also for generating enough rural as well as farm income as well as non-farm income. Professor is looking into giving an overview of the agriculture sector. Now, as most of you will agree, any narrative of this particular pandemics is going to be incomplete without looking into the migration issue. Apart from the human tragedy and the kind of suffering that we have been exposed to in the media, it has also raised some developmental issues about the extent of rural-urban migration and the extent of interstate migration. And Professor Rajesh Jha is again looking into exactly that problem, not so much the migration phenomenon as such, but the root causes behind this, the nature of development. And obviously, some of us will agree that it's the fact that agriculture is not becoming a viable option, lack of productivity, lack of income generation, and the fact that rural non-farm income has also not grown sufficiently. So that's something he has looked at. And another paper in the labor context by Professor Purnamita Dasgupta and Andri Ladde. So it's not just the rural labor or the migrant labor, which is vulnerable, but also a large section of the labor force is vulnerable. In fact, now that we're in unlock 1 and a lot of activities have resumed, it's not that everybody has gone back to their jobs. Okay, so sustainable recovery with jobs is an important thing. And in fact, many people have started thinking about work from home, digitalization and whatnot. So that's going to bring in lots of labor dynamics, which is what Purnamita and Antila did. Lastly, there are these two interesting papers on policy. I don't want to talk too much about policy here because one of the most successful policymakers and implementers is with us today. To say anything and then make it for myself, but good intentions do not necessarily make good policy. So much more to policy making and policy implementing. And especially in the present context. Given the multi-layered agency relationship that we have, implementing something requires a lot of planning, a lot of information, and a lot of inputs. And we have these two papers. One is a very specific one where Professor Suresh Sharma is looking at why social distancing was very likely to fail in India, not in a global context, but in parts, and what needs to be done. So that's a very specific thing. But Mousumi Das and Sabyasachi Kar, I think both are present here, so you can ask them if are making a more general point about when we do policy making or when we design policies, to what extent we should be looking at the incentives of the agents who are going to respond to these policies. Okay, so I think of a number of examples, including the migrant story, where while designing our lockdown policies or things like this, is it the case that we should have looked into the incentive of these migrant class or their employers or whatnot? So that's again something which is worth researching, and a lot can come out of it.
This terrible pandemic has hit us. We've taken very stringent measures of a lockdown and so on. Despite all that, the number of deaths keep on rising. The total number of daily deaths is still rising. So that is causing us a lot of despair that despite all this, we are still not getting there. But I do want to say that while the total number of deaths is going up, it's not as though the lockdown had no effect, because the daily deaths were growing at about 18 to 20% when the lockdown was introduced. Today, we've steadily come down to, it is now less than 4%. Last few days, it is, occasionally get a spike, especially when they discover unreported deaths and so on, as happened in Maharashtra a few days ago. But really, the date has now come down to 3%. So clearly, we are trending down. Eventually, we'll get to a point where the total number of deaths will stop increasing. But meanwhile, of course, we paid a huge economic price for all this in terms of the lockdown, the shutdown of the economy, and so on. And work that my colleagues and I have been doing at NCER. Incidentally, we also have a webinar day after tomorrow. Some of you may have gotten a notice for that. I hope you can join. We are seeing that the quarter we are just about to end, output has fallen by about 25% compared to last year. This was what we felt in a preliminary webinar we had about a month ago. Data that has subsequently become available, for instance, the index of industrial production, number of other sources, confirm that ballpark. Actual numbers do vary, but that's broadly where we are. And the question is what will happen in the remaining months of the year. Our assessment is that it's a counterfactual that in the absence of any fiscal or monetary stimulus effort, output for the year as a whole would have gone down by about 12 to 13%. I say this is a counterfactual because, in fact, a great deal has been done. And this is the other part of this narrative of despair, that you will often hear the government is not doing anything, hasn't done anything, etc. The fact is that actually the government has done quite a lot, as I'm going to try and explain. However, in the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, close to 20 trillion was announced, it was packaged, I think, in a way that caused a lot of miscommunication. Because in that package, indeed, the fiscal component of that was just 1.3%. And the media analysts very quickly got onto it and said, look, this is all hype. You're saying 20 trillion, actually just 1.3% of GDP, etc. Now, they were right in that critique. However, what was not correct in that critique was it did not look at all that had been done before this Atmanirbhar Bharat package. And that is what I want to draw attention to. Because Atmanirbhar, most of it really was, some of it is reforms, which don't have any impact just now in trying to turn the economy around. They may be very valuable in the medium to long term, but not in terms of immediate recovery. Another very large part of it was monetary infusion, liquidity infusion by the RBI, and incentivizing more credit flow, especially to medium, small enterprises, and so on. So if you add all that up, actually, so there's quite a lot that's been done on the monetary side. And on the fiscal side, you have to count as stimulus for the year, not just what's been done in this package, but the total fiscal deficit that was there already in the central and state budgets, which add up to about 6.3% of GDP. Then additional borrowing that was announced prior to this package in order to make up for what was obvious by then, the huge shortfall in revenues. And that was also a pretty substantial package. And then you got this 1.3% as part of this fiscal stimulus. So all that comes to something pretty close to, actually it comes to about 9.7% if you don't count the additional headroom that has been provided for the states to borrow more. Now, unfortunately, conditions have been attached to that, and states may not borrow that 2% extra. But if they do, then you're looking at a fiscal stimulus of close to 12%. And you add to that, this is just the budget part. I'm not counting in this the off-budget borrowing, what we call the public sector borrowing requirement by public enterprises and so on. You add all that up, and you're looking at something more than about 13% or more. So that's a huge stimulus on top of the roughly 8% of GDP, liquidity infusion. Now, if all this were allowed to work themselves out, all this stimulus, in fact, we have done work similar to what Manoj and others are doing at your institute. I would like to see those numbers. We came out with an assessment that if this was allowed to play out, the demand stimulation was allowed to play out, we'd actually end up with positive growth of about 1.3% of GDP. However, of course, this will not be allowed to play out because we all know that there are very strong adverse shocks on the supply side. There's a huge increase in mortality, especially among medium, small businesses. There's a complete disruption of supply chains. There's this whole tragic, episode of our migrant workers, the reverse migration and so on. We are all familiar with that. So we know that there's a big adverse supply shock that we are facing. How much is very difficult to quantify at this point of time. So we have looked at a number of scenarios, ranging from the one where there's no supply constraint to one where supply constraint restricts GDP growth to about 10%. And the good news on that is that in any of these scenarios, while things like the fiscal deficit and the inflation rate, the current account deficit may be somewhat elevated in some scenarios, they are not something that should be causing us alarm. For instance, the current account deficit in any scenario stays below 3%. The fiscal deficit remains below 8%. Inflation also remains between 6 to 8% and so on. Of course, we have not in this factored in the possibility that if there's a sudden stop in the sense of foreign portfolio investors panicking and this rising risk aversion pushes them to suddenly increase the withdrawal of money, it's already happening. That could actually lead to rapid further depreciation of the rupee very quickly, and that would have all kinds of destabilizing effects. Which I have, which is not there in a modeling exercise, but I'm just mentioning it as a word of caution. Now, I don't know how much more time I have, but let me just say a little bit about the monetary side. The total borrowing that all this will entail, sovereign borrowing, you're looking at something like 18 to 20 trillion rupees. Now, this is something unprecedented for our financial system, which is already under great stress, as you know, from long before this coronavirus crisis hit us. So I think that's the big challenge that our financial sector is facing. They have tried to stimulate demand by reducing the repo rate. The transmission is not happening or is very weak. Lending to the credit flow has virtually slowed, almost got choked. It's actually gone down when it comes to some categories like medium and small enterprises, the private sector as a whole, and so on. So those are not really working. But the biggest challenge, as I said, is how to handle this huge borrowing from the public sector, the sovereign borrowing. And our feeling is that no single channel is going to do it. Part of it will have to be, financed by the commercial banks, possibly with a second round, in the secondary market, some acquisition of this by the RBI, which is indirect monetization. To some extent, we feel that the ways and means advances which are there have already been liberalized a bit. We think that could be taken a little further to help, especially the states, because most of this huge expenditure, by the way, has to be undertaken by the states. They are in the front line, not the central government. And finally, there will have to be, we feel, some amount of direct monetization of the deficit in the sense of the RBI directly acquiring government debt through private placements. So let me stop there. I'll be happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure there will be some questions, but we'll take everything right at the end. Rohini, it's...
Yeah, thank you very much, Ajit. So I just first want to congratulate IEG and you because you've done what a lot of places aspire to do. I remember being at many board meetings where they said, can't we get more out in the policy domain? Can't we do things that are somewhere between journalism and full-fledged research papers? And this is exactly that. And so many congratulations to you and to all the faculty who really stepped forward. You know, if it was me, I know I'd say, well, maybe I don't know enough. Shouldn't we wait a few years? Maybe 5 years later, we'll figure out what's going on. And the point is really not to be right. It's really to start the discussion. And this is exactly what you've done. So many congratulations. I also liked the range of the pieces in the volume. So you just touched on so many different things. The first two chapters talk about the macroeconomy. Then you deal with agriculture. Indrani talks about the health system. Moshami and Sabyasachi talk about incentives. So there's a huge range of things. And it can really stimulate research. This is good both because it will get people to realize that there's such a variety of people in the IEG doing interesting things. But I think it's also the ideal way to start up within institute collaborations because you start to think together. And so that's really great. So I'm going to say a couple of things on the two papers that I read a bit carefully, and then some general thoughts on the COVID thing. So you'll tell me, I forgot to put my 10-minute timer on. So, but
That's not.
I'm putting it on now. You've got it on. Okay. Because of my own work, I read Indrani's chapter and Maushami and Sabyasachi's chapter carefully and looked through all the rest. The thing I found most interesting about Indrani, she talks about the Kerala story like many, many people have. And the Kerala case is truly amazing because in a sense, in terms of testing availability, PPE kits, all of these things, they weren't doing any differently from anyone else. They were all relying on what was coming from the center. And the big difference was really in how their local institutions were functioning. One thing that I found really interesting in Indrani's piece was she looks at hospital beds, physicians, government spending by different states. And by countries, I think also. Let me just. Yeah, and she looks at different states. And the most amazing thing is really that Kerala is not doing, it's not as if Kerala or India are doing that well in terms of the physical facilities. There are few physicians, there are few hospital beds, there's low government spending. But our personnel in terms of nurses, we actually have a fair number of nurses. And so in a sense, that's good news because it means that if we rethink the health system and provide the right physical infrastructure, then we might make it a lot more capable and resilient. Because personnel are much harder to train. We have a problem with physicians, but if we have the nurses, that's a big, big deal. And so it's relatively easy to provide physical infrastructure. It's really hard to train medical personnel. One thing that I wondered about is really the spatial pattern of these health facilities. And I think that's something that we might want to think about in the future, because when you have a pandemic, what really matters is how quickly can you get someone somewhere, not just what exists in the state, but really how can you react to crises. And again, that makes me wonder about Kerala's success, because maybe it's different because there's very few remote villages in Kerala. Villages are large and you can relatively quickly get to health facilities. A time when we have 5% of GDP spent on healthcare. There are lots of things that we could do now, and I think it shows us the way for some of those changes in the short run. The paper by Maushami and Sabyasachi brings out this very important time and consistency problem. So when you're looking at the migration and you're looking at all these people going away, part of the reason might be that they just don't believe that the lockdown will be 3 weeks. And everything that they've seen around the world has shown them that it isn't likely to be 3 weeks. And so having a government actually put in place policies that it can commit to is going to be very important if you want to provide people the incentives to follow them. So that's one interesting thing there. So just a couple of my thoughts then for the second half of my piece. What should we do now? And one of the things that I've been convinced about, just looking at all these different stories that are coming up, is that we need to decentralize very seriously. So our democracy is not a democracy unless it's democracy all the way down. And this has implications for the relationship of the center with the states, of the states with the local governments, of the villagers with the village governments. And so we really need it going all the way down. So how do we operationalize that? And I think one big way in which we do it is by not deciding in the center how much more is going to go to which particular scheme. I think we have to say that, okay, these schemes are doing the same things for poverty. Let the local area decide what's important. So, you know, some areas like Bundelkhand in UP are having hundreds of thousands of people going back. Some areas in Chhattisgarh have very few people going back. And so it really depends on what is going on locally. And we need to give localities the resources to respond. The second thing is, let's see if we can live in a world where more capital goes to labor. And you might argue that, look, there are advantages of agglomeration, but certainly all my fieldwork seems to indicate that if you have schools, hospitals, roads, and electricity, and piped water, if you get those four things going, then a lot can get going even without industrial parks. It won't be the same things that you have in industrial parks, but you'd have activity going on. And so the big thing with Bihar, for example, is they had 15 years of phenomenal growth, but it was mainly growth that was driven by the state investing in physical infrastructure. That didn't lead to a lot of private investment because there was no electricity still for industries in most of the state. So if we get the basic public goods going, we'll see things happening locally. Capital will move to labor. And we've realized that in the pandemic, it's really inhumane for labor to be moving to capital. It has never made sense in economics, but that's in fact what our development policy has been. Finally, something very little that could be done overnight, which is we could make the PDS function locally. So now what's going on is that people are producing, procurement is done, all these food grains are going out of villages, and then they're going back in through the PDS with all its leakages and with all its difficulties in administration. If we just allowed people to buy locally, whatever they're allowed to buy, and allowed them to buy it at these prices, that would make a big difference. And if we do these things, I think we move to much more ethical public policy. And it's not just going to be good for redistribution, it's going to be good for sustainability, it's going to be good for climate change. So I think it requires bold moves if we want to look different, but I think we really can do it. And the question is whether we can get enough voices together to convince people that there is an alternative. And so let's try. That's where I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohini. Thank you very much. Can I invite Mr. Das?
Thank you, Ajit. Since I'm part of the IEG family, as you said, I would only echo what Rohini said in her opening couple of minutes and say how happy I am that you have joined together to bring out this book. I'm happy to see more research activity, more activity generally in IEG. And the 9 papers, the 17 authors, and the speed to it. I'm going to make some very brief remarks because Sudipto and Rohini have covered a lot of ground, and I do want to leave sufficient time for Mr. N.K. Singh, the chairman of the Finance Commission, and who we are honored to have today. First on health. In Rani Gupta's paper, William Joe and his colleagues' papers, key country and probably across the world is that there is no lobby for public health. There is a very powerful lobby for private sector healthcare system. And nobody is arguing for, pushing for, working for strengthening the public sector, public health system, infrastructure, training of more manpower, etc., etc. And listening to Rohini and her reference to nurses reminds me that, I wear a hat, which I'm chairman of the Sasakawa India Leprosy Foundation. There are many girls coming out of leprosy colonies who want to be nurses. And we are actually providing grants to them to be nurses. And the message from Rohini, which I registered, is that we need to multiply this kind of program so that all the girls who are applying and who want to make nursing as a career should be helped to do this. So we've got to create a powerful lobby for the public health system, and I'm going to look to the Chairman Finance Commission to tell us whether he is a lobby, whether he is that powerful, will allocate more resources for the public health care system rather than our dependency on a private sector healthcare system, which is not able to cope with dealing with 1.3 billion people and providing healthcare services at low cost. I move to my second point. The papers on rural economy, migrants, agriculture reform, and sustainability, which have come from 5 of your faculty members in 3 papers. We have all recognized that the migrant issue has been one which is disastrous, deep distress, but I see in it now a new opportunity. And the new opportunity is this: how do we now move the development model to a decentralized development model? We stop concentrating on urban build-up and urban congestion and everything around the big cities. How can we take advantage of these people having gone back to their homes and their villages and put in resources there? So the Manrega program, increased allocation, the 50,000 crore scheme announced by the Prime Minister for migrants, these are all very positive things. I think we need to work now to ensure that the rural economy, the district level development is the focus, is the priority as we go forward. Because these people who have gone back, they don't need to go back only into the agricultural sector. They can be in many non-agricultural areas of employment and self-employment. So we need to think this through. It will be harder work. We've been used to a certain way of planning our economy and our growth process. We need to reinvent ourselves as we go forward, taking advantage of this very unfortunate development of millions of migrants going back to their villages. I got a message today from someone in Manipur who is a fellow of the Ananta Centre, and she says to me that 10,000 young people have come back from the rest of India into Manipur. They're all around Imphal and those areas, and we are trying to see how we can provide them with employment and self-employment opportunities in Manipur. So there's somebody thinking about them. They actually would like to stay there. They want to be with their families. This would actually result in a much better society for us. So we need to work on that. My last point is on micro-entrepreneurship. I have been associated with an organization called Bharatiya Yuva Shakti Trust for many years. I'll just give you some statistics. 7,000 trained mentors, 5,500 micro-entrepreneurs, 250,000 jobs generated, 250,000 jobs. And this is only in select states. If we can take this nationwide, and it doesn't have to be one organization do it, it can be multiple organizations. We can focus on micro-entrepreneurship. By the way, many of those micro-entrepreneurs are millionaires today and employing 40, 50 people, the ones who started early. So this is great potential for us, and we need to go down this road. On the growth point, just one brief comment. As we went into Unlock 1, as you called it, Ajit, in your article in Indian Express, and industry started working again, I am getting feedback from heads of companies around the country informally. There's an automotive company whose order book today, as of yesterday, was up to 80% of last year, including significant export orders. There is a capital goods manufacturer in Bangalore who is in the power equipment area, whose order books are full now because there is demand for power equipment. And this is including a substantial amount for export orders. And there is a construction machinery company, which I know of, which has now got significant orders flowing in June. So maybe we are underestimating the growth situation. Maybe there is more happening, under the surface than we know. And as we go forward into July, we will get a real sense of how quickly the economy will recover.
Thank you, Mr. Das. On that positive note, can I now request Sri N.K. Singh, sir?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ajit. How would you want to orchestrate this? For me to make a few remarks now and then to take a Q&A later, or to do the Q&A now and then to make the remarks? You are the chair. It's for you to decide. I'm willing either way.
I mean, it will be nice if you make a few remarks now. And then...
Okay. So, first of all, let me say that as someone also associated now as one of the trustees of this prestigious institution, how privileged I am to participate in the virtual release of the excellent ensemble of essays covering the COVID period. Let me also say that the selection of these essays are really, in my view, address the real challenges in some ways which the economy and the social ethos is going to face over the coming months. Let me also say that by doing this, the IEG and doing also some inter-institutional collaboration to which Rohini referred to, I think that we are trying to really capitalize and optimize huge talent which we have. And in a certain sense, a publication of this kind is really making us wiser in real time. Because as Rohini put it, that quite often you tend to do research which is of largely of an exposed nature. But to put out literature in real time is, in my view, seeking to shape policy formulation in multiple ways, in directions which are positive. I also feel that, frankly, from the viewpoint of the Finance Commission, we compliment you, Ajit, and all those who have collaborated with you, that this is of enormous value to us in the Commission. Because clearly, since we are going to give a 5-year report, the dominant theme of this 5-year is a Finance Commission working in COVID times. What has the pandemic altered in terms of the many assumed parameters and many of the sort of things. So this essay, these set of essays give us a flavor of the sort of issues on how to really enable the Finance Commission to address some of these challenges in a period which in some ways is unique, not only in our life, but many lives which have gone by and many lives to come. The challenge becomes even more serious because unlike any other, the uncertainty, the unpredictability, and the nature of this pandemic, which makes decision-making that much more complex. From my point of view, I want to say 5 points. First, I'm going to count on you Ajit, under your leadership and Tarun's help. And I heard Sudipto to say that NCAER is undertaking a similar initiative on the webinar day after, maybe if something useful comes out of it, to give us tangible ideas on how you expect the Finance Commission, what you expect from the Finance Commission in seeking to address the sort of contemporary challenges which these set of papers tend to bring out. This I want to make a few more generic remarks on the points which these three outstanding panelists have created, because in my remarks is embedded many of the debates which are currently going on. Sudipto, I thought that by the words which you used, the narrative of despair which you used, and considering what Tarun said about the speed with which some of the segments of industry and the economy are seeking to come back and seeking to register very decisive growth, really is really examples more than anecdotal that the narrative of despair is not really a realistic picture of what's going on. Lots of activities are going on which are not being grasped or grasped in its entirety. And certainly I would say that in terms of the communication in which most of our economic analysts and newspapers, they are still, I think, locked in the period of the narrative of despair. If there is a narrative of optimism, I think that, Sudipto, you did point out the combination of macro and a combination of, in that macro framework, both the monetary and the fiscal policy. Few will disagree with the numbers which you have, that with the ongoing fiscal stimulus, which has only been added by subsequent action of the government, both pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, there's a fair amount of fiscal stimulus which is already in the economy. And if there are supply side constraints which do not become the overarching neutralizing factor, then I think that we should see a somewhat faster pace of recovery than most people would attribute it to. So notwithstanding what Q1 might do on Q1, most people believe that Q1 is going to be really not a very encouraging figure. But from what you say, what Tarun said, and from the papers which I read, I find Manoj Panda's paper here does point out more or less in the same direction, that the story of gloom need not carry forward automatically to Q3 and Q4, and that unlike the rest of the world, given unsatiated consumption in this country, given a fairly proactive government both on the monetary and fiscal side, you need not see this hangover of this pandemic for many years, which they are presenting internationally. And we would be greatly encouraged if we can get some more feedback from you, Ajit, with you and your colleagues, on how you see the 5-year story panning out, and that the 2020 Q1, at best Q2, need not overshadow everything which is going to happen over a medium term. Yes, the issue of the monetary policy and the huge public sector borrowings of the so far is an issue which has to be seen. But I think that the government is fairly flexible on this. And from my own conversations with the Reserve Bank, I think that they are conscious that so far the 4 lakh crore extra borrowing for which the government really made that announcement has not necessarily resulted in yield curves registering that in a very significant way. Perhaps there is slack in the private sector borrowing requirements, and the yield curve is conscious of that. Also, I think that, Sudipto, you are right that on the ways and means advances to the states, perhaps more could be considered by giving states greater flexibility. Although on the issue of whether they will avail of the 2% extra FRBM limit or not, of which only 0.5% is unconditional, the 1.5% is tied to certain performance criteria. Many states were anyway pursuing these reforms independently, and therefore quite a few told me that they would be in a position to avail of this extra room for maneuver. But Sudipto, since you have been associated, you are a distinguished member of the Economic Advisory Council of the Finance Commission, and since you have first-hand experience, let me put it to you that I would love to hear from you. In what manner you believe that the federal architecture, which is a centerpiece, has been challenged by the issue of pandemic, and what are the lessons of the federal polity which you think it would be appropriate for us to conclude. Let me say that in addition to some of these complex macro issues, in response not only to the outstanding paper of Indrani, which I have read with great interest, and thank you, Indrani, if you are in the audience, for the excellent presentations and the interactions which you had with the Finance Commission and your current paper. Let me say that, Tarun, I have a straight answer to your straight question, that is there a votary and is there a lobbyist for public outlays in health? Well, one of the very robust themes of this Finance Commission is going to be health, in which public outlays are going to play a very, very significant role. We realize that somewhere down the line, perhaps maybe 10 years ago or earlier, we stopped investing, particularly in terms of improving the quality of primary health centers, in terms of district hospitals, and building infrastructure at the cutting edge. So that's an area in which I had set up a group on health policies, which has had several meetings, it has had lots of rounds of consultations. We have been in touch. So one of the definitely very important themes of this Finance Commission's recommendation is going to be in the area of public health policies, and including to address this issue, I think Rohini touched on it, that you see, Rohini, one of the big things I think which happened in the area of public health, whose full story is yet to unravel, is the fact that two very debilitating regulations which existed have now been changed very substantially. One which you know, that the Medical Council of India, which was a throttling influence in terms of improved supply side responses, in terms of the availability of doctors and so on, you have now a totally different, totally different Medical Council of India, or Medical Commission of India, which is looking at the entire regulatory framework. But I am pursuing the issue of the paramedics, which I agree with Tarun, has a huge multiplier gain. I myself, with some analysis, found that investment in paramedics have one of the highest rates of return in the area of public health. And small sums of money can, if district hospitals are empowered to act as nursing colleges, in addition to nursing colleges, the number of paramedics which can be trained is going to be a dramatic multiplier change. And there is a critical bill which has passed all stages. The health minister assures me that it is now gone through this Parliamentary Standing Committee on Public Health, with which we were also in close contact with, and it is in the final stage in the Rajya Sabha. And that I think that enactment, which covers the allied services, which is the paramedics, is also going to add to the improved regulatory framework, which will enable the sort of the supply side responses, both in terms of the professionals and in terms of the paramedics. We also say that you couldn't be more right, Rohini, when you said that the issue of the spatial distortion is one of the critical disabilities of our entire structure of public health. We have looked at the availability of health personnel and health infrastructure across states in India, and nothing brings out more sharply the contrasts. Say, for instance, if you compare the availability of paramedics in Bihar or parts of Eastern UP with all India averages, it's a telling story by itself. And the big challenge, which has still to be addressed, which lies ahead of us, is just as perhaps the pandemic begins to maybe reach its near peak or near peak in some of the metros, what happens when it begins to reach the more rural and more dense parts of India, where the availability of health paramedics and health specialists are abysmally inferior to all India averages. So the spatial distortion which you brought out is, I think, very dramatic. I think your point about empowering local institutions by the example of Kerala is a very good example. I myself, during my visit to Kerala lasting over several days, did visit many of these local things. And of course, it's the nature of Kerala's geography, population dispersal, where there are really no rural area. There's one continuum. Anyone who has traveled in Kerala would any day marvel at the sort of things, the manner in which the local institutions if any state really has set a lasting example of what third tier can do, it is Kerala. And if any state is reaping the benefits of what it has done in a critical period like this, it is Kerala. So I will stop there on far as that is concerned. Just two more points and I will stop. One is, I think, the point of what is another dominant theme of the Finance Commission, apart from the area of public health. We certainly, unlike other commissions, we certainly intend to look at what are the kinds of reforms, economic reforms, some of which have commenced in a significant way, and some needs to be very significantly catalyzed. And I think that in that structure and typology, obvious candidates are, for instance, agriculture, on which Tarun knows, and Sudipto, you would know that for years, those changes in laws which had eluded successive governments have been now enacted through an ordinance. I agree with Sudipto that this is not something on which we can expect a multiplier gain in the current year, or maybe even the next year, but certainly over a medium term, a constellation of this will change the overall growth trajectory, which we know is central to an improved management of the entire story of macroeconomic stability, because it is that which is going to help you retire public debt and which will help you retire the fiscal deficit also over the medium term. Tarun, you made a very important point about imparting of local skills without having the migrant workers to come back to where they were, which will overall increase the productivity of labor and minimize its costs. I think that the intention of the 50,000 crore package, which the finance minister announced just a few days ago, directed at only migrant labor, which broadens not merely the digging of wells and those kinds of activities, broadening the area of disciplines and skills, and attach them as part of the allied agro and agro-related activities is, I think, in my view, a positive step. And what can one do to buttress that and build on that 50,000 crore initiative designed entirely towards improving the skills and the skill sets of migrant workers would be something to which we need to consider as we go along. So I'll end here to say that thank you so much, Ajit, for this impetus which you have provided. Thank you so much for a set of these papers which you have brought out in public domain. As I mentioned to you, that this Finance Commission is Finance Commission in COVID times, and how to address the COVID times, a rich menu of the sort of things which we need to address, the macro growth story, the issues of the health, the issues of migration, the issues of skill inculcation are all areas which are integral to addressing the broader fallout of the overall pandemic. So thank you so much for this opportunity which you have provided to me and to the Board of Trustees for enabling me to share my thoughts with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Thank you very much. Can't hear him. Now, Rohini, you want to add something now, or Sudipta, do you want to say anything? Or shall I invite others? There are a few who would like to say, make comments or ask questions.
Yeah.
So
Do that. Do that.
So I'm going to ask Professor Manoj Panda now.
So Manoj, can I ask you a question?
Let me unmute him, sir.
Yeah.
You have to unmute yourself. Okay, he's unmuted now. Yeah.
Okay. So let me
Yes, sir.
ask Manoj that I read your paper with interest, and it was not incongruent. It was not incongruent with what Sudipto says also, because in your presentation also you chalk out a less depressive story on the path of recovery than the normal narrative would suggest. So maybe one or two things on this as well in the comments which you make. And what makes you believe that the anecdotal stories or the anecdotal instances which are of a telling nature mentioned by Mr. Tarun Das could become a broader picture?
Sir, no, overall, I think it depends on what is our reference point. If the reference point is a business as usual scenario, what we would have expected in the absence of pandemic, then of course, I'm not that optimistic. The loss is quite a bit. But if we go over the previous year, which many people are telling compared to previous year, it will be 20-25%, some are even telling 30-35% loss. I don't get that. If I go to the numbers, I don't get that. And after all, what is the extent of the lockdown that was there? For about 2 months, maybe about 50-60% of the total activities.
We're losing you, Manoj.
Oh, yeah, I think.
No, we can hear you.
Is it okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
We can hear you.
And after that, I also feel that there are the second point is, once the lockdown is over, may not be in June, but from July or August onwards, there will be certain areas where the activity will be more intense. And that makes me optimistic. Particularly in health, I myself have assumed in the paper that instead of a decline, actually there might be 20-25% increase in the public expenditure. So given this,
Now I have lost you.
Yeah.
they are 20-25%. For the year as a whole, it will be about 1/4 of that. Hello.
Indeed, it looks as though Manoj's connectivity is very
No, I'm not able to hear.
Ajit, can you hear me?
Hello?
I can hear you, NK.
Yeah, so then maybe if his connectivity is weak, we could move to the next. So, can we move?
Can move to the
Ajit
next.
also seems like he's frozen.
Yeah, that's what it appears. So
It must be an IEG campus.
maybe.
Problem.
Then
Tarun can navigate us for the rest of the session.
so yeah, Tarun. So can I then ask a question, if you permit me?
Yes.
To Sudipto. That Sudipto, I thought that very interesting points which you have made. If you were to look at therefore over the medium term, Sudipto, that's you go beyond the Q1, Q2, maybe even Q3 of 2021. You begin to look at the next 2-3 years, and it's very difficult to do that because we don't know the past, the pandemic as yet. And incidentally, one of the things that we need to also keep in mind and I think that the government has been pretty correct in maintaining that it should not be assumed that the last of the fiscal story is over and nothing else is in the offing. Kept the options open because the pandemic is still evolving. Keeping all those uncertainties in mind, do you have any view on Sudipto, on how you think this medium-term story is going to evolve and what kind of a rebound and so on? Second, I think that since I agree with you entirely that we cannot, out of some of these reform initiatives, expect an immediate growth multiplier, but over a somewhat longer period, the assessment of the growth multipliers on some of these, in my view, some important reform initiatives, particularly I would point out in the area of agriculture, some of the stories which was quite stolen.
Ajit, you're back. Did you want me to respond to
Yes, please.
Singh's question?
Yeah, I kind of got lost. I mean, I got disconnected, so I don't know what happened.
Mr. Singh was asking me a question about the medium term. If you want, I can respond or wait, up to you.
Yeah, no, you please respond, and then Sabyasachi has something.
Yeah, I'm now purely guessing. I haven't, done homework on what's on the medium-term outlook. We should do it, and if there's any time, we would be happy to do a little bit of that kind of number crunching for the Finance Commission. But that apart, I think one of the big risks that we have to beware of externally is the attitude of the foreign investors, and I think we should assume that there will be quite a lot of risk aversion on their part, so that whatever we do will largely have to depend on what we do internally, which means policies of the government. I think it has done quite a lot. Right now, we should wait to see how the response plays out. If there is a decent response, and by the way, you have to do it in this anecdotal way, the way, the kind of stories Tarun was telling us, because there's no other way of forming judgments. If those responses are good, then I think in the medium term, the government would probably need to focus on consolidation. Right now, we've forgotten about anything like fiscal deficit and so on. We just want to help the economy get back on track. Once it gets back, I think we need to start again worrying about those issues, because then they will become problems. We'll swing to the other side. But everything has to be evidence-based. I think by the time we get to the third quarter, we'll have a much better sense of what the response is actually looking like. Agriculture is the big shock. We are expecting a normal monsoon. We're going to get 3% growth probably in agriculture. The other big shock absorber, of course, is the service sector, especially government. One of the few subsectors that will grow because government salaries and so on are not affected by this kind of shock. So we have very detailed breakdowns of what's happening subsector by subsector. I'll share that with you later. But there are large areas of the economy which are going to come back fast. I am concerned about the recovery in manufacturing, but if the kind of story that Tarun is saying for different types of subsectors, then even manufacturing might come back. But we should wait, see what's happening in the third quarter before we can firm up our ideas over the medium term. That's what I would say just now.
Thank you. Thank you, Sudipto.
Okay. We have Indrani and Sabyasachi. We'll take two more comments, and we are already past our 6:15, but we started 5 minutes late. So, Indrani, do you want to comment anything?
Not really. I mean, I'm just honored to be here among these distinguished panelists. And I'm encouraged by our Chairman of the Finance Commission, Mr. Singh's words that they're going to look into the health sector. I really hope that we get out of this ad hocism that governs the health sector policy so far. And if that pandemic is going to teach us anything, I think it should be that we need to plan in the health sector for long-term sustainability of health financing. And if we go back after the pandemic to our 1% or 1.3% and not really do anything about the infrastructure that Mr. Singh mentioned and about workforce, then actually we haven't learned anything. So I hope that it doesn't come to that. And I really, we will be working on these issues for longer, in longer papers. That this is just a very short overview. So I'm very happy and really pleased that all of you liked our joint compilation. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me, Ajit?
We can hear you very well. Yeah.
So my comments are not really about my paper, but about more about the macro implications. Since that's the other hat I wear. I've been doing macro modeling for a long time for the Planning Commission, and we've had some of these challenges that we're facing now even earlier during the financial crisis. So I'd just like to talk about 2-3 problems or issues that macroeconomists will be handling that are not standard problems. One is, Professor Mandal has presented a model, Professor Panda has also given some forecasts, but any model actually has to base itself on some basic assumptions about things that we usually think are exogenous to the economy. And surely one of the most important things that's exogenous this year is the way the disease itself plays out. And it seems that even now, globally, we still don't have enough idea about how the disease is going to play out. So that's going to bring in an additional amount of uncertainty to all these forecasts, whether we'll have a second wave, a third wave, or how exactly, it will affect our labors, supply, etc. So that's one big challenge for macro forecasters in this kind of situation. The second issue, the second and the third issues are more policy issues. Again, one is fiscal policy and the other monetary policy. Both have been touched upon by Professor Mandal, but other panelists have also talked about it. Firstly, about monetary policy, the challenge is that usually when the RBI deals with monetary policy, they really have to either think of a big demand shock or a supply shock. But what we have here is basically the two shocks playing up together. And, basically we don't know at each particular point which of these two shocks are going to be the bigger shock. And so the monetary policy has to be even more deft than usual shifting itself from demand constraining kind of policy to supply and supporting policy, and this is not going to be easy at all. Finally, I come to fiscal policy, and this is something that Shri N.K. Singh has also touched upon. And this is, in fact, something that I would say has become easier. This is about, the Professor Mandal put it as the biggest challenge of the government, which is how to fund this expenditure. And he mentioned that we have to go in for various sources. But the source that's going to be the most problematic is what we called direct monetization by the RBI. Now, in India, apart from, and I'm very happy to hear Shri N.K. Singh say that the government is very flexible on it, but the narrative that is there amongst economists is extremely conservative. And in fact, they are not very positive about any kind of deficit monetization. But I think that what needs to be kept in mind is that we are in a unique situation. It's a shock of a unique kind, and we can't go by standard textbook theories anymore. And I was very happy that yesterday, Fitch, one of our rating agencies, clearly spelled out that that they are going to look at long-term growth and long-term fiscal consolidation, not at what the government does in the short run, which is a clear kind of signal that the government should monetize if it needs to. So I think these are some of the macro issues that need to be kept in mind. Thank you.
Rohini had a comment on the macro part.
Oh, I just had a very quick comment, which was that while these input-output matrices that are used for projections are very useful, I think we have to keep in mind that these matrices are changing dramatically, both because preferences will change and because resource costs and technologies will change. So we just have to be really careful in those projections. I think we need to go back to the drawing board. So for example, the restaurants, people's preferences will change on restaurants, they'll change on travel. Some of these are going to be long-term. Again, in terms of goods coming in from different countries, those things will change. And so it's just that we can't take those basic building blocks to be what they were. And I think it would be really great if we had a collaborative effort across multiple institutes that really tried to see what should go into forecasts. That's the only comment.
Thank you. We're really out of time. So if any last comment, we'll take it. Otherwise, I'm going to thank you all and thank you all the participants. And I'm sorry that we have exceeded by 10 minutes or so.
Yes.
Thank you, Ajit, for organizing this. It was very interesting.
No, thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very short notice also.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tarun. Thank you, Ajit. Thank you.
Thank you, Thank you.